I'll hand over the microphone to the next chair of this session, Stéphanie Ginalski. Thank you very much for agreeing to join this panel. So, yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bernard and Isabel, and also all the people who helped organize this conference. I think this morning was very stimulating and, very interesting, and still a lot of more super interesting things to go on, and notably with this panel. So this panel will be on science, slavery, and legacies. So as Bernard already said, unfortunately Thomas Bartoletti will not participate in the end, so we will have two presentations. The first one will be with Monique Lichtenberg. She's a postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich, where she studies the provenance of natural history collections in Switzerland in light of their colonial entanglements, which is kind of a new field of research in Switzerland. And maybe I would like to add that she is also a founding member of the project Zurich Colonial, a project of the public history that proposed a tour through Zurich Colonial Pass, so you can find the project online if you don't know it already. So the second presentation will be with Nelson Sanjad, who is a senior researcher at the Goldie Museum, research unit of the Brazilian Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. So he is dedicated to the social history of science in the Amazon region, and his current research project addresses more specifically the construction of scientific knowledge about the Amazon from a transnational perspective. So we will start with you, Monique. I give you the floor and the microphone.
Yeah, thank you so much for this kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, thank you to Bernhard and Isabel as well for inviting me to Lausanne today. I've really enjoyed the presentations and discussions so far, and I've learned a lot because I feel a bit like an imposter here. I'm not an expert on Brazil, to make that transparent. My regional specialty is usually on Southeast Asia, on Indonesia. And the reason why I'm presenting what I am presenting today is that I was not looking for Brazil in the archive. Brazil came to me. And I think this shows again how important this conference is, because you don't even have to look for Brazil in the Swiss archive actively. It's very present. My talk has a slightly different title than the one on the program. Probably nobody noticed, but I will still point it out. And the reason why it changed is because what I'm presenting is going to be work in progress with new archival material that I just started analyzing. So I'm very open to any comment or suggestion or critique at this stage. And the paper in general is part of my larger project, which, as mentioned before, studies the provenance of natural history collections at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH Zurich, from kind of this global colonial perspective. And today I'll focus on one specific collection that connects Switzerland, Brazil, and colonial science, and most importantly, colonial commerce. The story begins at ETH Zurich's entomological collection. Its curator, Michael Gref, showed me a collection of Agrias butterflies from the Brazilian Amazon. And you can see these are just two shelves of dozens of shelves of butterflies, and dozens of them from the exact same species, just with very different color patterns. And this, to me, kind of raised questions, such as why did a collection need so many variants of the exact same species? Because from a taxonomic perspective, this does not really necessarily make sense. And to answer this question, we have to take a look at the broader history of the entomological collection and the networks through which quote-unquote exotic insects reached ETH. So ETH's entomological collection was founded in 1858, based on, and you might be familiar, or those from Switzerland might be familiar with this name, based on Heinrich Escher Zollikofer's private museum. Escher Zollikofer came from this kind of wealthy business merchant family, very famous in Zurich, and he traded with cotton and other plantation goods connected to slavery in North America to re-establish the family's fortune that had been lost. So here we have a first connection to slavery. And during his time in North America, he also built a global network of collectors who supplied him with insect specimens, which he bought commercially. And his son, Alfred Escher, even more famous than his father, donated the collection of 66,300 insect specimens to ETH Zurich after his father had passed away. The entomological collection's first director, Oswald Heer, then would expand it further, mostly through trade and exchange networks, since ETH did not really fund any collecting expeditions. And the collection itself hence grew through a complex global system, not just through the individual passion of individual scientists. The next figure I'd like to introduce is Robert Biedermann Mantel, a name that's far less well known, but whose story runs in striking parallel to Escher Zollikofer's. Biedermann was an industrialist from the city of Winterthur at a time when the city was a thriving industrial hub and had become home to major companies like Sulzer, that still exists today. Around 1900, he briefly worked in Singapore before becoming co-director of Blumer and Biedermann in 1901, a company involved in cotton spinning, twine production, and iron casting. And alongside his business career, he was also a passionate ornithologist and butterfly collector. And in 1955, after he passed away, ETH inherited his collection that included 428 not pieces, but cases of quote-unquote exotic butterflies, including those cases of agrias from the Amazon that we saw before. And Biedermann didn't collect all of these butterfly specimens himself, but he, like Escher Zollikofer, he purchased them from commercial operators. In what follows, I will argue that Robert Biedermann's collection at ETH Zurich opens new ways of looking at the colonial history of natural history collections in Switzerland. For first of all, most existing research has primarily focused on well-known individual collectors, such as the Saracens or Judy. And in contrast, I think that Biedermann's collection allow to highlight the structural dimensions of colonial collecting in Switzerland that were embedded within highly professionalized and very often profit-oriented enterprises that capitalized on the bourgeois fascination with the quote-unquote exotic. And second, and very closely related to that, the Amazon's extraordinary biodiversity and the exotification of the region's landscape and peoples were, as I would claim, very deeply intertwined discourses that shaped both colonial science, colonial collecting, and colonial commerce. But let's start from the very beginning. How exactly did Robert Biedermann manage to collect butterflies from the Amazon without ever traveling there himself? He purchased them from butterfly trading companies that were mostly based in Germany and France. And in the archive, I was able to identify around 15 such companies connected to his collection alone, and I assume there were many more operating at the time. Many of these companies, and this is also very interesting, were run by university-trained entomologists and tried very hard to maintain an academic appearance. So, for example, you can see here this German trader Hermann Wernicke calls his company a Naturwissenschaftliches Entomologisches Institut, so a scientific institute. But this was not a university-affiliated institute at all. All of these companies were commercial, privatized institutions operating in a highly global and competitive market for natural history specimens. This brings me to the question, how did butterflies from the Amazon reach buyers like Robert Biedermann in Switzerland through companies in Germany? The process involved 3 central institutions: trade companies, banks, and insurance firms. The butterfly trading companies would send boxes filled with butterflies directly to their wealthy customers, along with lists like the one you can see here on the left, where the customer could mark which butterflies they would keep and which they would send back. Once the customer had made their decision, they would transfer money through an international bank. In this example, through the Schweizerische Bankgesellschaft, and in this example, the money would be transferred directly to Manaus in Brazil, to the company Behringer and CA. And third, insurance companies protected the valuable butterfly shipments both on part of the trader and the customer. So in other words, complex institutional networks and infrastructures were an integral part of the trans-imperial butterfly trade I'm trying to describe here. Butterfly traders did not just rely on beautiful specimens, but they also used quite clever marketing strategies to appeal to the buyers. And the most important one of these strategies was that many company owners would promise to their buyers to name new species after them. And Robert Biedermann, for example, had both the Agrias roberti, here displayed on the top left, and the Agrias biedermanni, so one for his first and one for his last name, named after him. And on the right, you can also see a letter from a butterfly trading company that shows how sending more specimens of the Roberti was used strategically as a subtle way to encourage him to buy more and spend more money, quite simply put. Which brings me to the next question. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of butterflies, but how did these companies actually acquire the masses of butterflies for sale? They relied on a dense network of on-the-ground collectors. And one example I would like to present to you is that of Hugo Carlos Boy. Hugo Carlos Boy was originally from Lodz in Poland, and like most of the collectors on the ground, had a working class background, so he was not an entomologist. He was originally trained both quote-unquote theoretically and practically by the entomologist and entrepreneur Anton Hermann Fassel, who had himself conducted several collecting expeditions in the quote-unquote tropics. And Boy himself collected mainly in the lower Amazon for the companies A.H. Fassel and Staudinger and Banghaas. And he would receive advances from the companies and sometimes even from commercial buyers like Biedermann to finance his expeditions and to collect butterflies. And Hugo Carlos Boy's letters that are available to me give us quite a vivid glimpse into the realities of collecting in the Amazon. So, for example, in 1928, he wrote about being hit by a storm during a collecting expedition and finding lodging at a fazenda, where the people were very kind, and it turned out that he knew the overseer, the manager of the fazenda, from his previous trips. So what this shows to me is that fazendas served as crucial infrastructural hubs for natural history collectors like Boy, and I would argue that through that there is at the very least an indirect connection between collecting butterflies and the plantation labor regime and infrastructure in Brazil. And there are many experts that are more knowledgeable about that than me, but that often relied on coerced or forced labor. However, due to the physical distance and the lack of direct control, the relationship between collectors such as Boy and the butterfly trading companies often ended in conflict. And for example, Boy, at some point, he tried to leave his contract with Staudinger and Bang Haas before collecting enough butterflies to make up for his advance. And Staudinger would then publicly, here in a publication in an entomological magazine, defame him as a quote-unquote wild man and a quote-unquote Bolshevik, which was the worst thing Boy could have been in the eyes of Staudinger. And after successfully leaving his contract with Staudinger, Boy ended up in significant debt. So another butterfly trader, Hermann Kotsch, who would employ Boy later on, wrote to Biedermann directly, suggesting that a small monetary contribution would surely be of use to him, to Boy. Should you make the remittance in form of a letter, it would be advisable to emphasize that the sum is intended quite expressively for Mr. Boy himself, as otherwise the family, Boy's family in Brazil, half-blood indigenous people, might make use of the money. And so again, I think this passage is really interesting because to me it also shows how Boy's negative traits in the eyes of people like Kotsch or Biedermann were not just connected to his class background, but also tied to his family with an indigenous woman. That is really a repeated narrative that I encountered in the archive. So, let me conclude before we come to the discussion. So to conclude, I think that the case of Robert Biedermann and his butterfly collection reveals several novel and interconnected dimensions of colonial natural history collections in early 20th century Switzerland. First of all, it demonstrates how butterfly collecting relied on a complex infrastructure, including traders, banks, insurance companies, fazendas, etc., ensuring that the butterfly specimens reached the buyer. Second, the Amazon, both its landscape and peoples, was exotified, and this discourse was inseparably linked to the butterflies themselves, in the sense of what Patricia Purchert and others have called commodity racism. So in other words, the insects were framed as luxury, as exotic, as other, and crucially with that as expensive goods, appealing directly to bourgeois tastes and fantasies of the quote-unquote exotic. Okay, I'm finishing. Is it good? Okay. And third, lower class actors like Hugo Carlos Boy were integral to this complex network of collecting, carrying out the labor of collecting and navigating local networks. And at the same time, I think the example shows that these relationships on the ground were complex and entangled. And in Boy's case, for example, the work of collecting also helped finance his young family, his indigenous wife. And this illustrates how colonial science, commerce, and personal lives also very often intersected in ways that challenge simplified notions of collecting and collections as just being comprised of elite bourgeois European actors, but it goes much further than that. And with that said, I thank you very much again for your attention and for having me here as a non-expert today.
My presentation is about a group of Swiss scientists who chose to work in the Amazon at the end of the 19th century. Can I? Okay. Yeah. The region was experiencing a period of great economic and social dynamism due to the rubber trade. Belém had become the exit point for 80% of all the rubber produced in the world, as well as the entry point for people seeking work and for capital seeking investment opportunities. In this city, one institution stood out in the field of science, the Museum of Natural History and Ethnography of Pará, founded in 1866, but which only began to have a stable staff of researchers starting in 1894. This occurred under the administration of the Swiss zoologist Emil Goeldi. He initiated what I call the Swiss Germanic years, when the institution was populated by young doctors, both men and women. It's a very important aspect, because besides the science matters, it was a social experience there. Women were included in this experience. So, when the institution was populated by young doctors, trained at universities in Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. Consequently, a strong tradition of exchange with the scientific community of Central Europe was established. In this slide, you can see the names of all the scientists and technicians, many of them from the Zollikofer atelier that my colleague told before, technicians who worked at the museum during that period. This is the scientific colony that Goeldi aspired to establish in Belém, which remained active for nearly 30 years. Brazilian names appear only among the administrative staff, the herbarium assistants, the maintenance workers, and the apprentices. For several years, I have been studying how this colony operated, why these professionals migrated to Brazil, their theoretical and academic ties, the scope and quality of their intellectual output, how they adapted to life in the Amazon, what alliances they formed, and how they resolved their conflicts within local society. We don't have time now to discuss all the people listed here, nor would it be possible as research has not been conducted on many of these figures. But I can say something about the person who created and managed this colony for 13 years, Emil Goeldi. In this slide, he appears alongside the Swiss botanist Jacques Huber, head of the botany section and his successor as the museum's director. Goeldi completed his doctorate at the University of Jena in 1884. In the same year, at the age of 25, he was hired as deputy head of the zoology department at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro. Three main factors influenced Goeldi's decision to move to Brazil. First, his personal fascination in tropical forests. Second, the difficulty faced by young researchers in obtaining good academic positions, since the university system in Central Europe, though extensive, was quite closed due to the prevalence of lifetime professorships. At best, Guildy might have become a secondary school teacher or the director of a municipal museum. And third, the existence of an informal network of European scientists who controlled access to positions overseas. In Guildy's case, he was recommended for the post at the National Museum by Ernst Haeckel, his professor in Jena, following an inquiry from the museum's director. During his 6-year tenure at the institution, the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, Guildy published 30 works, mainly in Swiss and German journals. These publications reveal a scientist who was highly attentive to local issues and allow us to glimpse the social relationships he established in Brazil. The best example of his integration into local society is the research he conducted for landowners on a pest that was devastating coffee plantations in the Paraíba do Sul Valley. Guildy described the coffee plant disease and identified a worm as its causal agent, which he named Meloidogine exigua. This research had worldwide impact and established his authority in the field of tropical biology. With the proclamation of the Republic in 1889, Guildy and all the other foreign scientists were dismissed from the National Museum amid conflicts with the new nationalist and xenophobic government. Guildy then went to work with his father-in-law on a Swiss settler immigration project called the Alpine Colony. Between 1890 and 1891, nearly 200 people were settled in an area of dense Atlantic forest with no infrastructure. Many conflicts arose between Guildy and the settlers, leading the agricultural project to a major failure. In 1892, one of the settlers, Leonard Scher, maybe a relative of you? No? No? Okay. So Leonard Scher published a book containing serious accusations against Guildy, calling him a tyrant and claiming he paid more attention to rats and birds than to the colonists. Ironically, it was those very rats and birds that qualified Guildy for a new position, this time in Belém. These two books were written in the Alpine Colony. They are pioneering works in the natural sciences in Brazil as they compiled the available biological knowledge on these groups. Guildy assumed the directorship of the Museum of Pará in March 1894 and soon decided to create there a different kind of colony, one inhabited solely by people devoted to science and funded by the state government. In his own words, it was of the, quotes, greatest usefulness to give this institute the stamp and character of a scientific colony. This entailed the establishment of a strict work discipline and the requirement that staff live within the institution, dedicating themselves fully and exclusively to their duties. Guildy hired recent graduates, unmarried individuals, and also former soldiers because, as he explained, such people, quotes, more easily adapt to discipline of the establishment. The first question we might ask is how Guildy managed to keep this colony operating for so long. The answer lies in the fact that the Museum of Pará was a key institution within the Republican political project of that state. The museum envisioned by Guilde became an important part of the local elite's identity, both as a symbol of modernity and as an educational instrument. Guilde was extremely skilled at understanding the museum's symbolic meanings, as well as the genuine interest that the general population showed in the region's fauna and flora. He built a museum with an European landscape, yet inhabited by Amazonian plants and animals. In doing so, he satisfied both the cosmopolitan aspirations of the upper classes and the curiosity of men, women, and children eager to see jaguars, alligators, monkeys, tapirs, and other creatures up close. The relative autonomy and the stability enjoyed by the Museum of Pará allowed its researchers to conduct investigations across various scientific fields. It was a new experience for the northern region of the country and also helped project the institution beyond narrow provincial circles. In Belém, Guilde developed a work on taxonomy, biology, evolutionary studies, archaeology, and ethnography. His research program focused on themes of transformation, descent, and genealogy, but it didn't exclude traditional faunistic studies. In all these areas, Guilde explored what we might call authority vacuums, that is, unresolved problems that emerged as battlegrounds within the scientific community. His decision to focus the activities of the Museum of Pará on Amazonian nature was directly related to the interest the subject held in the European scientific community, still open to institutions and scientists located outside the main circuit of museums and university, since they provided exotic animals and plants. One of the most interesting aspects of Guilde's work was the strong interaction between scientific research and the political demands of the Brazilian state. I believe it's impossible to understand a scientific colony without considering how its scientists were mobilized by public authorities. Guilde was fully aware that the survival of his colony depended on his ability to navigate between politics and science. This is what happened in the research conducted by the Museum of Pará in contested international borders, such as those of French Guiana, Peru, and Bolivia. Guilde and other museum researchers were actively involved in geographical exploration, cartography, and the biological, geological, and social inventory of these territories. In doing so, they assumed the role of agents of the Brazilian state government. In this slide, I highlighted some works directly related to border issues in the Amazon, written by Emil Guilde, Jacques Huber, and Friedrich Katze. And this is the map indicating the expeditions of the Museum of Pará to the Brazilian Guiana. You can also see the location of the gold mines that the Brazilian government accused France of wanting to usurp. The change in the institution's name from the Museum of Pará to the current Guilde Museum was made precisely in honor of Guilde's involvement in the Franco-Brazilian dispute, which was arbitrated by the president of the Swiss Confederation in 1900. Guilde facilitated the international arbitration process thanks to his professional and family connections in Switzerland, and he also played a decisive role in constructing scientific arguments favorable to Brazil. In his work, Guilde often claimed political neutrality due to his Swiss citizenship. He even had a habit of raising the Swiss flag at his camps. He behaved as if he possessed the special authority to speak on matters concerning the Amazon, a kind of judge of science, even while receiving a salary from the Brazilian government. The construction of Guedes' reputation as a leading scientific authority on the Amazon was a process that combined Brazilian public policies and the development of a colony of scientists at the heart of the region. This process is evident even in Guedes' Ex Libris, designed by Ernst Lose. To conclude, I invite you to take a close look at this image. In the upper part, there is an indigenous man, animals, and an Amazonian landscape. In the lower part, heraldic elements qualify Guedes as a member of the Swiss aristocracy. The indigenous figure has a name. He is Valentin Parcategé, photographed by Philippe Fidanza in the 1880s. The photograph was purchased by Guedes, who appropriated the face of Valentin and added artifacts not characteristic of his people. The macaws were taken from an illustration created by Lose for the Museum of Pará. The heraldic arms appear on the coat of arms of Heinrich Guedes, alluding to two medieval castles in St. Gallen. I consider this image. Do you want a picture? Take it. He made a face so sad. I consider this image highly eloquent and revealing of the position Guedes assumed in the Amazon, as if he were observing the landscape from the balcony of his castle. On the other hand, from the height of the authority of a nobleman, entitled to speak the truth about the land he had chosen to live in. I stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So we have plenty of time for the discussion. We have like 45 minutes, and I'll do like my colleague this morning. So I'll take a first round of questions, and then if it comes more, we will take a second round. So who wants to start?
Thank you very much. It was a very stimulating presentation. I have two questions for Monique. The first one, I find very interesting the question of logistics. You know, how you show that they are using trade, banks, and insurance firms. And I was wondering if your character was using for his own business, you know, the same banks and the same insurance. Because I think it could be interesting because too often, you know, people who are looking at Swiss colonial history are looking on one way, you know, economic interest, on the other way, cultural and so on. And here we could have, you know, a way to, I think it's a completely artificial division, but here it will be a very interesting way to combine both. The second point, I think, but everybody knows here, butterfly, I think, from now, you know, we know the book of Harris on butterfly, you know, and on his Swiss missionaries in South Africa. So butterflies, I think, could be a very interesting topic to look at Imperial Switzerland. But I have another question, and it's related to the discussion of this morning, the links between private and state. Because you say that it was mostly private firms or private individuals who were buying, you know, to these butterfly funds and so on. And I was wondering if state museums, you know, in Germany, in France, but also in Switzerland, were buying such butterflies. And I had a last question, is the question at the end. You say that, you know, that colonial collecting involved actors across racial and class boundaries. I was wondering the gender dimension, because you just mentioned the wife of boy, but do you see women who buy butterfly and so on, or it was only a men activities and so on? And for Nelson, it was, I will use this picture because it's wonderful. I have one question. It's the links with Switzerland. If you could elaborate a little bit, I find fascinating and so on. There is arbitration, there is the scientific networks, but with the scientific networks, I was wondering, is it really Switzerland which is important, or is it the links to German universities? Because when you see his trajectory, it's because he was in Vienna, that he went to Brazil. After, when he came back, he went to Berlin and so on. He hired people, you know, German and Austrian, but no, I have the impression very few from the French part of Switzerland. So is it really a Swiss networks and so on? And so I would like you to, if you have all the examples of him favoring or promoting Swiss interest in Brazil beyond this arbitration, and so it's a question: what is Swiss, you know, in Brazil and so on?
Is there another question? Bernard.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks to both of you. Extremely, two, again, stimulating papers. So for Monique, yeah, I mean, also, as Thomas said, I think I also, yeah, I think it's really great to look at kind of coming to the history of collections and science, kind of with looking at it through a market lens. I think this is really stimulating. I was wondering, I mean, the big kind of important science, if we talk also, I mean, kind of go back to the discussions we had this morning, the plantation kind of complex. So I mean, botany, of course, is important. So I was wondering, were these completely two different kind of networks and collectors? I mean, did they only specialize in butterflies or on other insects, or was it kind of, or did they offer also botanical, or was the botanical circuit kind of like completely different as far as you can see from your sources, different kind of actors, or also different companies and enterprises? That's one question, and I have a similar question then for you, Nelson. Yeah, I mean, this museum, as far as I understood, it's really, it's like zoological, it's also etymological, it's also, I think it has to do with antiquities as far as ethnography. Also there, I was just wondering then, it seems to be a very cultural kind of project. I mean, also kind of for distinction, for kind of, yeah, creating class distinctions for an educated elite. I was wondering there too, if you could say a little bit more what the relationship between this kind of scientific colony was, then also then at the end of the day to the plantation, the economic interests, and yeah, botany and these kind of agricultural sciences. Thank you very much.
I was wondering if you knew a little bit more about the indigenous women that they were talking about, because I'm sometimes thinking that what is put forward is the action of a man collecting butterflies somewhere, but I wonder how to be partnered with a local woman, indigenous woman, is actually helping this act of collecting.
I saw the other hands rising. Maybe I will give you the opportunity to answer this first question, and then I'll take the other question. We have plenty of time. So we'll start in the same order of the presentation.
Okay, these were already a lot of questions, so I'm trying to answer as well as I can. Maybe starting with the logistics and the banks. So this is just a side note. Interestingly enough, Biedermann's, I'm not sure if it was his grandfather or his granduncle, founded the Winterthurer Bank, the UBS. So this was really a family, a very important industrial and finance family, not just in Winterthur, but for Switzerland. However, when it comes to, I do not know if he went through the same banks for his business as he did for his butterfly trading, because I just did not expand that much yet into the sources. However, he always switched banks, so he seemed to be very strategic to take like the cheapest transaction that was possible, considering that he transferred money to Germany, to France, to Brazil. So depending on which transaction, he would choose another bank. That's what I know. And the insurances were handled by the butterfly trading company. So that had nothing to do with him. That was just an extra service that they offered to their customers. Private versus state, did museums buy from these companies? I think the companies I looked at really specialized on wealthy individual customers, and I can mainly speak for ETH because that's the focus of my project. ETH did not really buy collections. They would not really spend. They did in the between 1855, the founding year, and the 1870s, just to build a stock. But after that, they would not spend money on collections. They had other ways to receive specimens. And gender, yes. So this Biedermann guy, this was a whole scene of rich people collecting butterflies, and he would correspond with collectors all across Europe, from the members of the Rothschild family who were close friends of his and who would frequent his villa. And there was indeed, I forgot her name, but there was one woman, she was a French aristocrat who also collected butterflies and who was also part of this scene. So it was mostly a male-dominated hobby, but there was one woman I know of who was part of Biedermann's network of rich butterfly collectors. Should we switch, or should I answer all of the... Okay. Then maybe let me come to, the woman, I would love to know more about her. And I have to be honest, I did not manage to go through all of the sources I have yet, but this will definitely be a focus, because I do know that Boy mentions her all the time. So it was not a secret or anything. This was quite an openly known fact that he had this indigenous wife. I do know that she was always part of controversies, but controversies are also always a good way to find agency, right? So that's definitely something I will pay special attention to when going through my sources. Then Bernhard's question. No, they did not. These companies did not trade herbaria. They did not trade plant specimens, even though that they were really specialized on insects, mostly butterflies. The relationship between botany and the plantation complex is a completely different story, but also one I'm interested in the context of my larger project, because a lot of botanists from ETH Zurich were very actively involved in the development of tropical agronomy as an important field of research in Switzerland in the early 20th century. But I will leave it there for now.
Boy was established in Manaus or Belém?
Sorry?
Boy was established in Manaus. Okay. So for Georgi, the point is, it's not he was not concerned about national borders. The point for him was linguistic and theoretical. He wanted a German-speaking community. 90% of their output was published in journals of Germany, Swiss, and Austria, in German. And the second point is theoretical, because he hired just the personnel that was highly trained in very modern, very updated research, especially on evolutionary studies, physiological studies, and also ecological studies. They were at the frontier of science of that time. And they really built a new level or a new pattern of science in the Amazon region. Maybe we could speak about ground zero from where this process became. In Brazil, I mean, not from naturalists or travelers that came and went away with their collections, but about traditions or about genealogy of knowledge that was built in Brazil. And they, besides they were a colony, they trained a lot of people. They trained all a Brazilian generation that could follow, that could keep their researchers. Even in the Guild Museum, we have a very strong tradition of, for example, of in German ethnology, for example, in Völkerkunde. We have in Brazil many traces, theoretical traces of anthropology, for example. In the Guild Museum, we have this anthropology connected very strongly with Central Europe from that ethnology. So the point, he chose these people, again, because of their language, because of their training in universities of Swiss, Austria, and Germany. But the important point is it should be led by Swiss people. When he was director, Guild signed an agreement with the Natural History Museum in Bern. So he transferred a lot of collections to Bern as a second repository of Amazonian collections. And Bern keeps this collection very well till today. A lot of very important collection of nomenclatural types, for example. So it was important that time to keep the knowledge about the Amazon under the control of German-speaking community. They were not fighting between them, but with the American. And many letters we find concerns about naturalists and scientists that were coming from America, the United States, to the Amazon. And they had to compete, and they had to go in front of them to do that work before the American arrive. So we find, I think, that they had a sense of collectivity as a collective group that was very, very adjusted, you know, between them and against Americans. Did I answer you? Okay. So they have special missions. They did their research, their own research, but they had to accomplish some agreements with the government. One of them are the border regions I've told. Another one was related to public health. Guild was involved very strongly with the research about mosquitoes on the Amazon, because of the yellow fever epidemics. And the third point is that they were very dedicated. They gave much attention to the rubber. All the research regarding rubber, seeds, reproduction, taxonomy, many things, many questions related to rubber. And it was very clear. It was very in the sources, and even in their agreements with the government, that they had to study rubber in many aspects, because rubber was the money. And so, as I said, they were tracing, they were walking on a line that was really between science and politics. They cannot be understood only by one side. We must think about these people in their daily life challenges, always negotiating and always dividing their time, their energy to their mission. So their mission as a researcher, as an individual, and as a government agent. It is very clear, and they really understood this very well. That's it.
So, 3. Okay. Tu peux passer.
Thank you. The urge or the need or the ambition of men to name species seems to be indomitable, unstoppable. I quickly checked our good friend Judy, who had Mikurus Judy, Montane guinea pig, Judo's yellow-shouldered bat. What else did he have? Birds, Judy's tapaculo, Judy's nightjar, Judy's wood creeper. I quickly checked Agassi, about 7 species, a dwarffish, a snowfly, a tortoise, a catfish, Publius agassi, Xylocrius agassisi, etc., etc. Now my question, has this urge, this tendency, this ambition ever been analyzed in psychological, pathological, psychoanalytical terms rather than in colonial terms? And my second question is there a case of a woman who managed to name a species after her? That would interest me very much.
Hello, or good afternoon. My question actually builds on a previous question about the indigenous person, because with like these expeditions, it's about knowledge production, right? And it's when we focus on, let's say this, obviously because of the Conférence conference, we're focusing on the Swiss and somewhat the German. But so much of this knowledge, you need indigenous people. This is indigenous knowledge, this is indigenous territory. And all of these explorers, to my knowledge, or most of them, you need indigenous guides, right? And I think earlier your photo maybe had indigenous people. I wasn't sure who they were, but, and often what's less visible is like these indigenous people are like, I don't feel like going with you today. I know. The boats, and like now that I've gone, I went to Manaus and east of Manaus. It's like the igarapes, the rivers, they come and they disappear. The streams that was here, it's gone then, depending on the season. And it's not, these images kind of seem as though you can just be a person who just walks into the forest and look, there's an eel, there's a macaco, there's a, it's not that way. Like you need to know how to find these things at what time, and that all is relying on indigenous knowledge. And I'm wondering, as we take this perspective of focusing on Swiss or German explorers, like how do we also account for indigenous presence, indigenous knowledge production, without which this kind of work I think is not possible. So I think, can we talk more about that? Like this image is like super weird, right? It's like this person's fantasies all in one place. But it's just so weird. But this is exactly this, right? The indigenous person just becomes like a weird artifact image, not even accurate, but they're not allowed to speak. They're not present as part of the knowledge production process. So I was wondering if you could both talk a little bit more about that. And there was somebody else, yeah.
Merci. My question is in the continuity to the Yuko Miki went. My full name. Did Goldie research team mention their indigenous partners, and how the scientific colony perceive the indigenous peoples? And maybe one question to Monique Lichtenberg. Hugo Carlos Boy, don't seems a very Polish name. Is there a surname, or why he chose this name?
Hi, this is also to kind of follow up on Yuko's question. In the 1980s, I visited friends who worked for the World Wildlife Fund in Manaus, and they had big teams of local people who did the climbing up into the forest canopy, because many of the items that were being collected, leaves included, required someone climbing the tree. And that was a skill that the scientists didn't have. So I guess in in following up on Yuko's question, right? How are some of these things that are fairly inaccessible because of the size of the trees and the physical condition required, being acquired through local communities?
We're building up a controversy here. No, I'm joking. But I mean, any type of work outside of Europe needed people who were local, any type of work, collecting, but also archaeology. And there are a lot of, let's say, indigenous or people from that side who are working on these teams. I don't know how to say that, but for me, it's quite logic that any type of work from where you don't know how the people are navigating space, you need people. I've been working for artists traveling to Switzerland, and when they come from South Africa to Switzerland, they need a guide here. And I mean, it's just, I don't know, common sense to me that indigenous knowledge is needed when you don't know how to navigate space.
Is it related? Yeah, okay.
Okay, as I am talking about Agassi later on, I do not suppose to comment, but take the opportunity to say that, for example, Urbano, which was described as a mixed man, was a clue, a very important person in Agassi expedition. He was a key person. He was the director of Diretório dos Índios. He was a leader of the community, indigenous community, and he was a guy who received foreigner traders and scientists and located them. William James went to live with Senhor Urbano and was amazed by his knowledge in the forest. In the narrative of Elizabeth Agassi, Louis Agassi, there appears Alexandrina, a girl, a Cafusa, which is mixed of Indian, black people, and maybe white. And she was described as a girl with this hair, strange hair, very smart, who climbed trees in seconds and understand everything. So without these links, you can't understand how this very important men worked and collected.
Oh, sorry. So I will give you the possibility to answer now.
I think I will start with the indigenous knowledge question, because I also think it has been mentioned by many of you. And I also think it's an incredibly important aspect, which I would have addressed more if I had had more than 15 minutes. But I would like to talk a little bit about take this as an opportunity to talk a little bit more about one of the photos I had in my presentation, which I didn't have the time to speak about, which is from Boy. And it shows like this boat on the Amazon River, and he does mention Laco and Manuel, who are, you don't have to, or, whom he both describes as being indigenous people, and he describes them as friends as well. So he uses the word meine Freunde, which Yes, exactly, here on the bottom. And I think this is really symbolic of, I agree with you, it's obvious that you need indigenous knowledge, that you need indigenous labor to conduct such an expedition. And what I find interesting in this specific case is the owner of the boat is Lako. So he is one of the people here. And my assumption is, from what I take from the correspondence, that Lako actually had some kind of microeconomy going on where he would capitalize on these collectors and make money by letting them use their boat and guiding them. And I think that's also, like, if we talk about the structures of collecting, that's a very important, on the ground, well organized level of collecting and expeditions and organizing expeditions. So just to mention that, and not to forget, I mean, identifying species, finding butterflies, knowing where they will be at what time of the day, that was all work that was done by indigenous people with indigenous knowledge. So I just wanted to agree with everything that was said. However, I think it's important not to underestimate that the power at play in these relationships. And that brings me to Hans's question of naming, because in a way, even though we all know they were important, they took up physical labor, they brought in their knowledge, they were not acknowledged in the taxonomy, they were not acknowledged in the official scientific publication. The only reason I know that they existed is through these photos and private correspondences, but the publishing in journals, in entomological journals, that filtered them out. And I think science in this way also plays the role of an institution of epistemic violence in a way. And naming is a form of epistemic violence, because the species gets pressed into a Latin taxonomy, which at the same time eradicates the indigenous name it may have. And I think while agency is important, I think power and violence is also important as two sides of this kind of encounter. I hope it makes sense what I said. And when it comes to the psychology of this naming, so it's really funny when you read how botanists write about the 19th century taxonomic naming, because they are like, oh, our colleagues in the 19th century, they created a huge chaos because they had to name they had to honor their founder, they had to honor their boss, they had to honor their professor, and they created so many subspecies just to account for all of the people who enhanced their career, that today we have a taxonomic chaos. It actually makes absolutely no sense in some cases how many subspecies there are. And I think that says a lot about the psychology of naming. And just one small side note, the Botanical Society has agreed to the International Botanical Society has agreed to make large-scale renamings of species and to integrate indigenous names. This is since, I think, last year this has been decided, especially with regard to problematic names. However, the Entomological Society has refused to rename any of their species. And just one very extreme example is there's a bug named after Hitler. And even that bug, they were the Entomological Society took a stance and said, no, it should keep this name. So, make with that information whatever you will. But there's also there's also not a general consensus among the taxonomic disciplines how to deal with that. Now I think I went, and speaking of names, last question. Hugo Carlos is not a Polish name. That's Yes, but my assumption is that he just kind of Latinized his name when he went to Brazil to make it easier to pronounce. I think, but then again, I'm not an expert. I think that was a common practice at the time from what I read. Yeah, okay, good. So that would be my explanation.
Okay, thanks for the questions. They gave me the chance to complement my presentation. Well, I should say first that the Goethe Museum that at that time was a strategic institution. It was right behind, in the government, it was right, not behind, under the governor, in the structure of the government. So every time they traveled, they used it to travel with salvo-conduto, I don't know how to say in English, with a letter of presentation, a letter of reference. So all the doors and all the rivers were open to them. And they had support of many people in the Amazon. Especially, I listed here some groups that they used it to work with. First of all, the rubber traders and the cattle farmers. These people were their sponsors. These people were the elite, and they gave power, they empowered the colony, the scientific colony, to do their job. The second group, the missionaries, especially not all missionaries, but the Catholic ones, that know all the hinterland regions, and they had contact with indigenous peoples. Third, the military forces that use it to circulate through the region. And the diplomats, especially the German diplomats that were also traders in the Amazon. And finally, the indigenous people. But they could not access indigenous people directly. They had to use a missionary colony or go-betweens. For example, indigenous that were already living in the city, or indigenous that had relationships with farmers or rubber traders. These special men could connect these scientists with their people, their villages. And then the scientists went with these go-betweens to the villages to contact the indigenous. And the indigenous are present in every trip, every travel, every excursion, they are there. One point, very important point, is that Goethe was one of the few scientists of his time, that recognized the role of indigenous knowledge, and he used it to write this. He used it to recognize their knowledge. For example, he visited once the Teneterra people at the Rio Capim River, and he published a paper in a journal of an English journal, very important English journal, Proceedings of the Zoological Society. And he wrote his words: "I will never forget the days I spent with the També. These were the most important days in my life. I learned a lot with these people because their knowledge on taxonomy is absolutely the same as mine." So he put in the same level the taxonomy, the classification system that indigenous, this Teneterra used, they put in the same level of the scientific taxonomy. And he declared in a very important journal, he learned about biology, about taxonomy with these indigenous. It's rare, it's really rare when we read travelers. But he did. So the second example, the first time travelers in the Amazon usually to travel along the rivers. They rarely go inside the forest. They do not cross rivers. The interfluvio, I don't know how to say it in English. the first time a non-indigenous scientist did a trip between rivers, walking, was a woman, Emilia Snitlag, a scientist that came to Belém in 1905. And she traveled between the Xingu River and the Tapajós River. I don't know if you have the Amazon map in your head, in your mind, but I say to you, it's a lot of land between the Xingu River and the Tapajós River. And she did it as the only non-indigenous person. She had her companions were just indigenous, 7 indigenous, 3 women and 4 men from the Shipaya and Kuruaya people. And she went in 1909. For the first time, she made the first expedition ever in the Amazon between 2 rivers. And he published a lot of papers and became worldly famous because of this trip. And so obviously she could not do this alone or just with European scientists. She had to do with indigenous, and she did. And she had a very special sensibility to deal with indigenous people. Most of them had this special. They could work together, they could talk to, they could, of course, give through gifts, a lot of gifts, many gifts. They used it to give to these indigenous, and of course, sometimes indigenous were obliged by the farmers or by the rubber traders. They didn't have the option. They had to go with the scientists. So it's a very complex relationship, but yes, they were always interacting with indigenous peoples and with all this hierarchical society of the time, military missionaries and rubber traders and farmers. They were all being, their lives and their work was always being facilitated by these social groups.
Thank you. We have like 5 minutes left if someone wants to ask a last question.
Nelson, for you, my question, how was the relationship between Gilde Museum and National Museum in Rio? Because if I understood you well, this was a foundational museum. The scientists circulating in the German-speaking reviews mainly. And how about this with National Museum? Was there a concurrence to say we founded what is the natural history in Brazil? How was the relationship between both institutions?
It's for you, right?
Thanks for the question. As I said, after the proclamation of the Republic, all the foreigners, scientists were dismissed. So this very small scientific community of Brazil, was fragmented. So from one side, National Museum, only with Brazilians. From the other side, the Museum of Pará and the Museum of São Paulo, that made a kind of alliance against the National Museum. So they, in fact, they were competing. So the strategy of Gilde was, I cannot compete with the National Museum, so I will be very, very specialized. I will be the person who can talk about the Amazon region. Only me can do that in Brazil. This was his strategy, and it worked very well.
Thank you.
Just a detailed question to this image that you showed, which is very absurd. So if I understood right, it is by Ernst Lose, a Danish postmodernist artist. Can you say more about the this combination? Why did this artist make this collage, let's say? And if you could speak more on the tools of visuality in colonization.
Do you know him? No? But you ever heard about him or read about him? No? Okay. So one of the most interesting aspects of this time for me is the incorporation of photography into research in the very inner methodological proceedings of research. And Geudy did this with Jacques Huber. Both were photographers. And Geudy hired this man, Ernst Lose. He came to Belém. He went to Belém to work with publisher. This is the word, publisher, a German publisher that lived there. And then Geudy hired him to the Museum of Pará and built a laboratory, a photography laboratory for photography there at the museum, and also for printing stamps like this. So he had the whole process of research from the field trips to the development of knowledge, writing, and also publishing and circulating knowledge. All the process he controlled it inside the museum. And this man, Ernst Lose, was a central figure for this public view or public face of the research. And he used it to take the pictures, he used it to draw, he used it to project the buildings. He was a factotum inside the museum. He had all the skills to draw and to talk with the scientists to construct things like this. And all the stamps, the scientific illustrations representing animals or plants. And Ernst Lose is a person to be more studied, because he was very talented. He worked at the museum until 1930, when he was murdered during one of the revolutions that took place in Brazil. Summarizing, this is the story.
Okay, thank you very much. The time is over now, so we can give a final round of applause to the presenters.